Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a gathering place, a celebration of the Gullah Geechee culture and community. And we have some very special guests with us today because our topic is, oh, what is our topic? Black Carolinians speak, sharing our stories during a pandemic. And this is a very interesting topic, and we're looking forward to our special guest. And I want to introduce our first guest, Miss Jannie Harriot, Executive Director of the South Carolina African American Foundation, and also chairperson of the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission. So we welcome Miss Harriot.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good to have
Good
you.
afternoon. How are you?
Wonderful. And thank you for joining us. We're really excited about today's show.
Well, absolutely. You know, I like talking about things that we do.
All right, then. Very good. I'm looking forward to this. And we also have joining us Mr. Joseph McGill, founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. And he's going to tell us about his project, how it was started, and also talk about what he's doing this coming weekend. And I encourage everyone to participate in the project of the South Carolina African American Commission and also the Slave Dwelling Project. And here he comes, Mr. Joseph McGill. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, you are so welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. So let's just dive right into, and I want to hear about each of your projects, your organizations, and what you're doing. But we'll start with the South Carolina African American Commission, Heritage Commission, and also Heritage Foundation. So there are two of us. So explain to us your mission and the purpose of each organization, Ms. Harriot.
Great. And I'd like to first say that Joseph McGill was a founding member of the African American Heritage Commission. We were council back then. But in 1993, the South Carolina General Assembly created the South Carolina African American Heritage Council for the identification and promotion of African American history and culture in South Carolina. 15 of us were appointed from across the state. Joe and I were the originals, so I have served for 27 years. And then in 2008, because the commission was created with no funding, we founded the South Carolina African American Heritage Foundation. And the foundation was founded to find funds and to support the efforts of the commission. I became the executive director of the foundation because at that time I was the vice chair of the commission and retiring from my daytime job. So I decided to devote my life to finding fundings for the work of the commission. And then I became chair again last year.
Well, congratulations. And and I can also speak on a personal professional basis that the foundation has been a great supporter of the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce and actually helped us do a workshop in 2019 with our arts and entrepreneurs. So that you do good work. You do good work, which in a few minutes. You're welcome and thank you. And in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the big special project that's just been announced, and we're helping to get the word out about it. So, Mr. McGill, tell us about your project, the Slave Dwelling Project, and how it got started and its mission.
The Slave Dwelling Project is a very simple concept. We find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States. We convinced the stewards to let us spend the night in these spaces to bring attention to them, because there was a point in our history where these buildings would be neglected. You could go to the properties where they are or where they were, and you could learn all about the nice, beautiful big house, the house on the hill, the architecturally significant houses. Now, these are antebellum houses or sometimes in states where slavery existed. You would get that story of the enslavers, but very seldom would you get the stories of those who were enslaved. So with that knowledge and knowing that buildings existed that could tell the stories of those who were enslaved, this crazy idea of asking these stewards to spend the night in them 10 years ago started. And 10 years later and 25 states later, still spending nights in slave dwellings and bringing attention to these spaces and convincing the stewards of these places that it's okay. It's okay to maintain these spaces, restore these spaces, but more importantly, tell the stories of the people who inhabited those spaces.
It's interesting that we're focusing on retaining our stories when our community, we have a tradition of oral storytelling. So, and I'm asking you both of these questions, and Mr. McGill, you can start, then I'll ask Ms. Harriet. Why is it important now that we retain these stories? Where is the interest coming from? And what's the difference between what we're doing now and what was done in the past? And that's
Well,
3 questions. But
well, yeah. Well, one important element is the fact that we're telling these stories. Folks who look like us, the 3 people on the screen here, we're telling the stories now. Now, when we make those attempts to tell that story, we get pushback, of course, and that's evidence in the most recent 1619 Pulitzer Prize winner, 1619 project, New York Times. All the pushback that she got when she put all that information out there about us, and she was challenged by all these white scholars, mainly these white male scholars who were telling the stories the way that they were telling them for so long. That story that they support, of course, is that that white male narrative. So it's important that we pull these elements out of our history, and it's good that when we can get a Jannie Harriot or someone like myself who live and breathe these elements of our history, because now again they're hearing the stories from us, because we bring we bring what's necessary to the story, the scholarship, and of course the DNA. So that's why it's important that we continue to tell our stories.
thank you very much. Ms. Harriet, what can you add to that? And I know you have a lot to add to that.
Absolutely. You know, it's ironic that as I listen to Joe talking about history being written by white male scholars, I am reading Gutsy Women by Hillary and Clinton and her daughter, Hillary and Chelsea.
Mm-hmm.
But what we know is that our stories were not told by us. They were not told accurately by those people who were telling them, because, as Joe sometimes says, they sanitize the history. And the reason that we thought this project that we're working on right now was so important, and I really must give Michael Allen credit for it, is that when we look back, and I'm not a historian, when we look back at the pandemic in 1819, there are no stories from African Americans. Nobody knows what we were feeling. I served on the Sesquicentennial Commission for the Civil War. Our stories were not heard. And when we said to the commission, we need to go into communities and hear stories. Well, why do we need to hear from these communities? I also currently serve on the Revolutionary War Commission. And I can tell you there is much pushback for not telling our stories. Initially, there was only one African American on that commission of about 25 people. Of course, Joe knows how I am, so I got myself appointed to the commission. So that, well, Jonathan Green said something to me, and we want to give him credit for that wonderful piece of artwork that he lent to this project. Jonathan Green said to me when I thanked him for that, he said, "This is what I'm put on this planet for." I thought it was so profound that I've been saying it ever since. I believe that what I'm put here for is to help tell South Carolina's story of African Americans. And what I always say is not Black history, it's not white history, it's our story. And I have, and I tell this all the time, I have, and it's the number's growing, I have now 176 nieces and nephews, 4 generations.
Wow.
Most of us grew up and lived in South Carolina. I want them to know the contributions of the people who came before them. So this is the reason we need to tell these stories.
So what is the name of the special project that was recently announced and that you're really working on?
The project is Black Carolinians Speak, Portraits of a Pandemic. And I tell you, when Michael brought this idea to me, it was really part of my heart to go forward for it. I had just lost 2 friends to the virus. To date, I've lost 5 friends to the virus. I'm not talking about people I know casually. I'm talking about people who were intimate friends of mine. Um, so it has become to me a mission that we hear the stories. I have relatives who are nurses, who are healthcare workers. I myself am not a registered healthcare worker, but I have a sister who has ALS, and I'm part of her caretaking team. And so it's important to me that we know. I mean, I can't go visit her because I may have inadvertently run by somebody who had the virus, and her immune system is highly compromised. So we wanted to hear those stories. I put out my story first. My story is the cover story for this project. And what happened to me was that I've not been to church, which is a very integral part of my life, in almost 6 weeks. And during that time, my church celebrated the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a gathering of all the people in my organization, usually in Columbia. We couldn't do that this year. Even though services were conducted, I felt that I couldn't attend because I tell people quite honestly, I'm in the over 70s club. I'm 77 years old. And I don't want to be out there and catch the virus from somebody else. Um, so it means that for me, somebody who is constantly on the go, and I've been in the house for 6 weeks. Of course, I do go to the post office. My nieces and nephews won't hardly let me go anyplace else. They'll call me every day. What do you need? But it has impacted all of our lives. I was thinking this morning, I wear 2 and 3 inch high heel shoes. I haven't had on a pair of high heel shoes in 6 weeks. So, we want to hear these stories from people, and we want to record them so that 100 years from now or 10 years from now, when historians are doing research, they will be able to see how this affected the lives of African Americans in South Carolina, notwithstanding the fact that we are affected more than any other population. I think it's 17% of the population is African American and 60% of us are affected by the disease. So
Yes.
that's tremendous.
There
So,
is an African expression, an African American expression, that every time someone dies, we lose a library. And
yes.
it means a great deal to me, not only because of my community, but my late mother was a librarian. And
Mm.
I grew up in libraries. I joke and tell folks she never needed a collating machine because she had 4 children that she would line up in the library, and we would sort books, we would sort paperwork. I mean, literally, I fell asleep reading books in the library. And she would also talk to me about her father. I never had an opportunity to meet her father. He passed away before I was born. But the stories that she would tell, I feel that I know him, that even though I
Mm-hmm.
didn't physically know him, I know him in a very spiritual way. And I applaud this program, this project, because you're right. 100 years from now, someone's going to read these stories and it's going to make an impact on their lives. And that leads me to Mr. McGill, the stories you're telling. Do you feel with the Slave Dwelling Project that you are telling the stories of our ancestors whose voices we didn't get a chance to hear those voices at the time, or most of them were not written down. So we don't know. But when you're in these dwellings, do you feel that you're hearing those stories and you can tell those stories?
Well, hey, definition of hearing them and actually the capability of that's a little tricky. But as far as the stories not being with us anymore, their stories, they were muted when they were here. It was illegal for them to be educated. An educated enslaved person is a danger to the system. Frederick
Mm-hmm.
Douglass, great example. He stole his education. Had his enslavers had his enslavers known that he was educated, that could have been his death. That could have been the elimination of his gene pool, or at least selling him from his familiar environments. Or someone took more extreme measures and cutting out tongues and things of this nature to keep them from communicating with others. When one would go up on an auction block, one thing that they had to do was, bare their backs to that potential buyer to show that potential buyer, that there were not any marks on his or her back. That's a sign of a defiant enslaved person, and you don't want to buy a defiant enslaved person to insert amongst your already docile and broken enslaved people. But the stories that are not there, this slave dwelling project helps to bring those stories alive, be the voices of those enslaved people who were muted while they were here on this earth. And by saving the slave dwellings, ensuring that the slave dwellings are here, it's easier to tell a story of people if these places exist. If the places don't exist, we can easily deny it, as we have been in the past. But one thing that the slave dwelling project does is to guilt folks, if you will. The place is physically there, you can't ignore it. You shouldn't ignore it. Some still do, because they are there. But being in those places, being in those slave cabins, being within those walls, you think about enslaved people and how they would have endured. You think about being in that space, historically, what they would have been thinking. All that was outside those walls was their labor being stolen. They have to be that the physicalness of that place. They had to be the people who made those enslavers live the life that they did and enable them to do those things. So those things go through your mind, that they think about running away. And if you ran away, where are you going? Where one plantation ended, another one began. And most of the times you were in swamps. Just recently, someone was killed by an alligator here in this state. Imagine the enslaved people taken to those swamps, with those alligators, those snakes, those leeches, those and whatever else hampered them. You thought about those things, and then you think about the patrols that were out there to ensure that if they were off the plantation, they were off there with a pass. And again, that's why they could not be educated. If you were educated, you could write yourself a pass right out of slavery, because a lot of times whoever you presented that pass to probably didn't know what they were reading, because education was a rare thing even for the haves. So if you were to educate your enslaved population, you're putting them in a position that's smarter than the 97% of the white population who did not enslave people. So these are the things you think about, and then you get to interact prior to the virus and the way we did it. We got to interact with folks physically at the space. They got to share the space with me. But before we went to sleep, we would have these campfire conversations, and in these campfire conversations, the subject matters were all over the place. They were vast, and we didn't shy away from subject matters like white supremacy and white privilege and historical trauma, weddings on plantations, and interpreting history on plantation. But the slave dwelling project, we ensure that we give the stewards of these places who are doing the right thing, we give them their credit. But those that are not, we're giving them a little time to try to do the right thing. But there's going to come a point in the future, maybe beyond what we're dealing with now, where if they don't want to come along peacefully, we may have to bring them along kicking and screaming. And we would much rather them come along, tell the stories that they're supposed to be telling at these places, not only in the southern states, but those northern states also, because, slavery existed there also.
Yes, it did. And before I ask you the next question, I want to remind everyone that you are viewing A Gathering Place, hosted by the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce, where we come together and have conversation about celebrating our culture and community. And our special guests today are Miss Jannie Harriot of the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission and Mr. Joseph McGill of the Slave Dwelling Project. Asking both of you, you can almost say telling your story is revolutionary. And that's a thread I'm hearing throughout what both of you are saying. So can you expound upon that a little bit? Is it revolutionary to tell our story, Miss Harriet?
It's revolutionary maybe for the rest of the world to hear our stories, but we've told our stories from the very beginning. We've always told our stories. Sometimes I have problems trying to delineate between what I experience and the stories that I have heard in my family. So telling our stories is an African American tradition. We've always shared those stories with our children from generation to generation to generation. I have a nephew who I am so very proud of, Michael Harriot at theroot.com. I don't know if you've heard of him. But
Yes.
sometimes I have to say to Michael, stop telling our stories, Michael, because you're telling the family business. because what? Because I see our family life all over his work. I mean, yesterday he wrote a story about the barbecue pit in the backyard. And I live in that house now. So we have always told our stories. And what I'd like is for us to get our children to telling the story. We tell them to our children and they tell them to their children. But I'd also like for us to do more recording of our stories, because handing it down is one thing, but I'm not going to be here forever. And as a matter of fact, we have a historical commission in my county where we can store our papers. And so everything that I do, that I try to store it there, because there's nothing, I have a hard time finding a picture of my parents. And so we want to be sure that our children and their children and their children can go back and find out, this is what my family was about. This is whose shoulders I stand on. And this is why I am who I am.
I just recently took a trip to Beaufort with family because the Mather School in Beaufort, my mother taught there in the 1950s, and I had two cousins who attended and finished the Mather School in Beaufort. And while we were down there, we went by the family cemetery, the cemeteries, to find the family plot, which I knew about because 25 years ago, my mother and I took a trip down there because my mother's family is from Beaufort. My father's family is Horry, Georgetown counties. My mother's Hampton, Beaufort, Charleston counties. And so I've been there before in the same family plot in the cemetery. And I wanted to make sure that my cousin knew where it was also. So if anything happened to me, the story continues. And
Right.
It's where our grandparents met and married within 3 months. My grandfather was the minister at First African Baptist in Beaufort, the town of Beaufort, and she was the organist. And the interesting thing is she was not Baptist. She was Presbyterian, but she played the organ and the violin and was the organist at the Baptist church. And they met, and 3 months later were married, and and henceforth the family continued and everything. And I think about that often. and think about the stories that I've been told as a child and as an adult by my parents, and how importantly it was in who I became, how important it was in who I became, and just that appreciation and having those pictures of my grandparents and just relating it back to my great grandparents and my great great grandparents, because that's how far back we can go in Beaufort, at that particular cemetery. But you know, it just really I am. And Mr. McGill, when you're in these dwellings, as you will be this weekend, and I do want you to tell us a little bit about what's happening this weekend with you and the Slave Dwelling Project, do you think about the family connections, the ancestral connections, not just the story, but the descendants of the people who were in these dwellings?
Yes, yeah, that's crosses my mind often. But to go back to Janie's point, just a little, yeah, we come
Mhm.
from an oral tradition, in these family stories, Marilyn, that you just alluded to, comes from that tradition. For us as African Americans, in Maryland, it sounds like you are the genealogist in the family. Am I correct there?
Yes, everybody calls me.
Yeah. See, well, every family needs one of you. In my family, that does not exist. If someone for me took my genealogical family tree back to 1890. I have not gone any further back than that, because I don't profess to be a genealogist. I don't have the patience that folks like you have, Marilyn. I just don't. I admire folks like you. But I guess I said that to say this. For African Americans generally, doing that type of research and extracting those stories from our ancestors before us was somewhat more difficult. Again, the first thing I alluded to earlier in this broadcast was the fact that they kept us uneducated. They didn't want us to be educated, so that oral tradition was necessary. Even in Africa, that oral tradition was a big thing with us. Storytelling it's our thing. We do that, but that storytelling also served as our history in a in
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have to connect the dots of why are we today dealing with some of the issues that we as folks are still dealing with. Why is there historical trauma in our lives? Why it why
That's
it
right.
are we suffering the shortcomings that we're suffering? Why are the dynamics, are the statistics of this current virus? Why does it affect us more than the white community? And what this slave dwelling project does is it helps us connect those dots, because in that period of slavery, in all that became that constitution that we have, that constitution had to be amended many times to include us, and it had to be amended many more times to include the two of you, because you're African American females. So
Right.
so we have to look at that document for the way that it was created, and the intent that it had, and knowing that in that document, that constitution that we created, we had the opportunity to snuff out that institution right there and then, but we did not. And what this Civil War did to us, what this Civil War brought us through. Yes, the Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't end prejudice, because
Mm-hmm.
all those things that were replaced by slavery, we're still dealing with today. Convict labor,
Mm-hmm.
redlining, Jim Crow laws, KKK,
Gentrification. Yep.
lynching,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
gentrification, all that. And this slave dwelling project, it helps us connect those dots, and it helps us put our element of the story, back into the narrative. We're not here. It's not the intent of the slave dwelling project to take away from the history that is already there, but to add to what's there, adding our element, into the story.
And not only adding our element, but telling truth.
Yes, definitely telling.
Exactly.
Yes,
Exactly.
and
Yes.
and
Because
that.
Joe,
and that's where Jannie and I we cross pollinate. We get in our lanes when we need to, and then we get back in our lanes and we do things in the manner that we do. And Jannie, this is a good time to let you know that I'm playing phone tag now with your proposal writer.
Great. About 3 weeks late, but that's okay. But yes, but the thing is that, and Joe says it quite eloquently to me, when he says sanitizing it. We want to take some bleach that Donald Trump wants us to swallow and bleach our history, and it cannot be bleached. It cannot be bleached. We are living, breathing proof of the fact that our ancestors were enslaved. We have been discriminated against. I tell people all the time, I'm a child of the 60s. I was one of those people out there marching. I understand. Our kids can't know that history unless I tell them. And so that's why it's important for us to tell the stories, but more importantly, to do the kinds of things that Joe is doing and that we're trying to do this, to write those stories down for record, because they will fix it to suit them, not to suit us.
And we suffer from it to this day, and it needs to stop.
Yes.
And in telling the stories, that's part of taking it back, telling the truth, and also ending discrimination, ending racism. You've got to peel it back and be honest about our history, be honest about our stories. And if you really take a look at it, there's a thread that ties all of these things that Mr. McGill just mentioned, all the way from the civil rights movement through the lease gangs, through lynchings, through enslavement of our people. There's a thread that you can knot at each time period and then knot to the next time period, and it's all connected. That's what's so powerful and empowering about the project that's been introduced, that we know 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when we're all gone, that they can still hear our voices and take strength from that and move on to the next level and address what needs to be addressed now. And in some ways, we are broken because our stories were not retained, or they were retained without our voice. And you didn't come out and say it, but it is, and you may have said it because you were saying a lot, that this also goes towards what people are now talking about with PTSD in our communities, with the mental health issues in our communities. It's because we're not connected to those stories. We've been disconnected to those stories. So it's very powerful what the Slave Dwelling Project is doing. It's very powerful with this new project that's been introduced, that we retain those stories just for our mental health.
Well, let's think about, I didn't live in South Carolina when Hurricane Hugo came through. My family lived here. I would venture to say that very few people know how Hugo affected the African American community. I remember I was living in New Jersey at the time, and I happened to be teaching a class and had to go from New Jersey over to New York and stop to call someone, and wondered why they were answering the phone or not answering the phone. And they said, well, Hugo. And my thing was Hugh who, because I had not tuned in. But the fact is, how many people know how many people were affected, how many families were affected by people who died during that time? So that's why it's important that we continue, not just with this project, but I'm saying we think that we will make this into a much bigger project about telling our stories about everything that goes on from now on. How is this affecting our lives? I bet there are very few, other than people like Jesse Jackson, on the record of African Americans and their feelings about Barack Obama being elected president. And that's something that we should have in our archives. What did African Americans in South Carolina think about electing a Black president? So it's I can venture to say that there are plenty stories about what the other race felt about it. But what about what we felt about it?
Well, we hear that story every day because, not to get political, but a lot of the
Right.
reaction is them telling their
Yes.
story, and people need to understand
Yes.
that, and they've controlled the narrative, but this is where we take back control and tell our own narrative, and that's so important. And Joseph, I see your eyes, you're pondering something. You want to say something, so go ahead and say it.
Yeah, these tragedies like this, they really highlight the racial disparities
Yes.
of what we're dealing with as a nation, as a people. Going into this school year, no one thought that we'd be at least a month, if not longer, into the fact that there would be no schools. But with that comes, you highlight the digital divide. That digital
Mm-hmm.
divide, meaning that if these kids are going to be engaged, they have to have the technology to do so. That
Mm-hmm,
technology comes at
mm-hmm,
cost,
mm-hmm,
and now you're getting into the accumulation of wealth, a lack thereof. And why has that wealth not been accumulated? That wealth has not been accumulated because that labor initially was stolen, and because
That's right.
that labor was stolen, and people come to plantations often, and I get crazy questions from folks, white folks. Questions like, well, was there cost sharing? No, there wasn't. It was single.
Cost sharing.
I was
Wait,
this and
like car sharing, like the vroom 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 car?
cost, COST,
Cost.
cost sharing.
Okay,
No.
gotcha. Okay,
So
okay.
we get that. I
That's
get
so
that
crazy
question.
too. Right?
Or
I
I
get
get
it.
I get a question like, well, were these enslavers good to their enslaved people? No, they weren't, because they enslaved them. Or they'll ask me a question. I'll pour my heart out to the audience, telling them about the slavery that existed in that place. And then I get a question about, well, what was the yield? How much rice does this place grow? I mean, I guess I should have that information. I should know that. But what about the humanity of it all, or the
Yes.
inhumanity of it all? Why aren't you concerned about that? And when I say that, and when sometimes you use the term free labor, and then someone will take it and twist it on you, and they say, well, no, it wasn't free. Well, the enslaver was providing them home, providing them meals. So they were in a much better place. So they'll look at it from that way. They'll try to take the humanness out of it to
Mm-hmm.
justify them indulging or taking in the story. They look at it from the wrong angle. They look at the output. They look at the numbers. They look at the economics of it, not the humanity or the inhumanity of it. And when folks, every time when you look at the economics, then the humanity goes away. It's like what we're dealing with today. If we pull the trigger on this thing too soon and go back into to the society and try to get back to where we were before all this, then give it 3 weeks. The gestation period of this virus does what it does in the 2 weeks, and 2 weeks from now we're in a worse place than we were, prior to this. So we try to, with this project, we try to connect these things. We try to make what we're dealing right now relate to, what was being done back then. I see some of these protesters with these signs, and they said it's, keeping me in the house is like slavery. No, it's not. It's
Not
not.
even close.
Not even close. See, that's their distorted history that they have. So that's kind of like the history that Dylan Roof that went into the AME church and
Right.
snuffed out the lives of 9 people. One of the things he said to one of the survivors, one of the people he deliberately left alive to tell the message, what they saw there. One thing that he stated to her was, they rape our women. Well, he was not knowledgeable of this fact, that during the time of slavery, there were a lot of mulattoes, people of mixed blood. And most of
Mm-hmm.
those folks were born of non-consensual relationship. See, now come forward with that. These folks have a distorted view of history, and that's that history that's void of the the African American element, the enslaved, the stories of the enslaved. And please don't get me started on what they did to the native. That's another whole storyline. But
That's another whole story.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that the thing that really, we want to tell our stories, want to know our history, but I tell you, as I look at how this pandemic is affecting kids specifically, I have two nieces that teach in Lee County schools, and Lee County is one of the poorest counties in the state. Of course, those kids don't have access to the internet, a bunch of them. Those kids hardly have access to meals. One of my niece's students came to school one morning and said, Monday morning, said, Miss Clyburn, I haven't eaten since Friday. I mean, this is a first grader. So what must those kids be doing now that school is out and they don't well, they're providing the lunch, but what about the weekend? So we ended up working with the district to get the buddy packs for the kids to take home on the weekend. But what must those kids be doing now? I mean, there was one kid whose family could not afford to pay the light bill. That was before the pandemic. So what must those kids be suffering now? The fact that my children that I don't have, my 176 nieces, they're not suffering because they have a supportive family. But every child does not have an Aunt Janie and an Aunt Marvell or an Uncle this or an Uncle that. Because my nieces and nephews, if their parents for some reason cannot provide for them, they can call an uncle or an aunt or a cousin. Every child does not have that. And so I think that we have forgotten about the least among us.
Mm-hmm.
And the least among us are the ones I think who are suffering the most right now. They can't go outside to play. And for those people, I went to the grocery store the other day, and that's why my nieces and nephews said, Aunt Janie, we'll go to the grocery. There was this couple in there with all these kids running around, no mask. The store people didn't have. I said, let me get out of here. Because who's to say those kids are not going to contact the virus? And, that false narrative that they had about children not being susceptible to the virus, that's not true. I mean, babies are dying. Children are dying from this thing. But who's going to speak up for those of our people who don't have voices? And that's what I want this project to do, to speak up for those who don't have voices. I could probably go give Lindsey Graham his dead body, since he says that the unemployment will not continue over his dead. Well, I'd like to give him a dead body. I have already written to him, believe it or not. I wrote to him before he made that comment, because I wrote to him when he was standing up there talking about he stood on there and talked about not voting for the bill, then wrote this big letter afterwards saying that he voted for the bill. Well, I wrote him back and said, yeah, you voted for it, but at what cost? And how did you have to make people feel in order to vote for a lousy? This country can afford to give every person in this country $600 a week. And you're fussing about poor people whose jobs are being taken away, getting $600 a week. The haves. Lindsey Graham doesn't have to worry about who's going to not provide a meal, who's going to cook a meal. Somebody's going to cook every meal that he eats. So, I think that as I said to somebody, I'm in a position that I can be a voice for the voices. And if we don't do that, we've fallen short of what God has put us on this planet for. And that's my story, and that's my preaching.
and that's all right, because as I'm listening to you and you're talking about the least of these, and as we collect these stories, that's actually data. And we are in an information age. And I had a show just this past weekend, our Sunday show, where we talked about community advocacy. And there are 2 points to advocacy I brought up. One, data, and passion. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to take the data with your passion, and that's how you change the narrative. That's how you move
Yeah.
people. Because a Lindsey Graham, he's not going to be moved by your passion.
Right.
And it goes back to that disconnect, that cognitive dissonance of he just cannot connect to the least of these. He's forgotten if he was ever even in that point to even understand where they were coming from. But you have to bring the data to the table, and stories are data. When you
Yeah.
start collecting stories and you can say this has happened, and it's a personal story, real stories, and you force them to listen to it in whatever form or fashion, whether it's in letter, audio, video, then you start changing the narrative. And I think we also don't need to get confused that the narrative is changing because this person who's elected changes. You got to kind of push them to change. You get
Right.
enough stories, it forces them to change. And if it forces them to change, now you're impacting policy that changes things. And I say this, I want to make a note on a local level because Georgetown County is my home. And they just did a video about unity during the pandemic. And it was very insulting. But it was all the elected officials, and I did put that out there. So I'm not saying anything I haven't put out there. They were talking about unity and some staff persons, senior staff persons. So my thing was there cannot be unity without equity. So you can
Right.
have unity all day long, but you can never have unity without equity. And this video simply was them controlling the narrative to prevent the stories of the least of these from being heard. Because this video is not changing policy. And policy is what impacts people. Policy is what continues the least of these. Is policy without compassion is why we still have a lot of poor people. Policy without compassion is why our priorities are messed up. And until we tell these stories, until we bank these stories in a database, and if they are constantly being told of time and time again, we're going to have the same disparities in health and society that are now leading to African Americans disproportionately being impacted by the coronavirus. And it's time to stop this. So recent years with the slave dwelling projects, we started to tell those stories of the enslaved people, the dwelling. And now here we are, we have an opportunity, and you're doing it to have a project that's not going to only impact 50, 100 years from now. This project's going to impact right now.
Yes.
It's going to impact right now. And people need to understand why it is so important that we go to greenbookofsc.com/speak and bank your stories. Tell people what is going on with you right now, what you have experienced, your feelings, because we could take that 6 months from now, a year from now, and go to Capitol Hill and say, this is what needs to happen. And honestly, shame them. We need to shame them into changing
Exactly.
policy. But we can't do that without the stories.
Well, I tell people all the time that I shame funders into funding projects. And Joe knows that I'm very good at this. Shame funders into funding projects for our people. But Marilyn, in your conversation, you've just given me an idea because I like this format. And I think this format could go very well with our project to collect some of these stories. We could do a weekly show collecting these stories. Ramon Jackson, who is our coordinator, I think he's watching us. So Ramon,
Yes.
take this down because I think that we should. And I didn't want to steal your idea, but but hey, if I see something good, but I think this is an opportunity. Although we are collecting these stories for research, we need to shame the public. We need to bring some of those children from Lee County onto this screen and let people see what's going on. So thank you for having me. I'm just really impressed with this.
Well, thank you for coming. The reason I started this was because well, I'm home. been doing a lot of traveling because of the Gullah Geechee Chamber, but I needed to continue. I took everything I was doing in person and brought it online. And I
Mm-hmm.
had plans to do this. A gathering place has a podcast. And I'm pretty sure you know Zenobia Washington Harper.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
she she's gonna be my
Yes. Mm-hmm.
co-host. Hopefully she'll come on. We've been talking about making this a podcast, and she's gonna be my co-host. Right now she's putting a garden together. And
Right.
so she's going to be coming on board as my co-host. But the plan was to make this as a podcast. But what happened, I realized people needed information and knowledge during the coronavirus. So I sped up my schedule and said, let's just get it online. And I'm learning as I go. My background is in TV, so it wasn't a huge learning curve. But I said, let me take this online. And what I specifically said, though, is I'm going to bring in African American change makers and leaders. So, one, our young people can see role models. So they can see
Mm-hmm.
people who are experts and who can share knowledge and information, because our young people need to see that this is a career opportunity. This is a business
Yes.
opportunity. Um, and not just talking about it, but what can you do to make it a career business? Because that actually allows you to have ownership of the narrative. And they don't want us to have that either. They don't want
Hmm.
us to
No.
have ownership of the narrative, because you can't control people. See, and right now I can't say I'm doing my thing. No one's controlling this except for me and who
Right.
I invited on and what I want to talk about on Wednesday and Sundays at 4 o'clock. And it just so happens that other people are interested too. So they're tuning
Well,
in and they're watching and everything. And it
right.
grows and this is it's very empowering, not only for me, but for the people who watch. And why is it empowering? Because you're getting knowledge. And you can take that knowledge and once again go and influence something. And I know
Right.
Joseph is already ahead of the curve because he goes on Facebook Live and he'll record. I've been watching about 2-3 years now, Joseph. You just turn on your phone, I'm assuming, and you talk, and
Yeah.
it's being archived. And that's
Right.
the thing with the digital divide. It needs to be closed because it's so easy to flick on that phone and record it, and now you have it saved. And
Right.
2 or 3 generations from now, somebody's going to see it. Somebody's going to see this show. I think this is my fifth or sixth show. I'll be happy to share it with the commission. I can
Yes.
download them, and you guys can have them for your archives. It's on YouTube. I finally got my YouTube channel together, and it really is just when I say celebrate my community and culture, it literally is that. It's an education knowledge too. And I know Joseph has been doing it for quite a while now. And so Joseph, one, how do you use the technology? And two, what kind of impact have you seen with the slave dwelling project?
Okay, thank you. I got about 5 minutes and I got to go. All right. And so yeah, I've
Good
been
timing then.
I've been doing I've been closing this digital divide as much as I can since Facebook Live became a thing. I was on it. I said, wow, what we do, we make do. And Facebook Live allows you to do that. As you stated, Marilyn, you just turn it on and talk. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I took that to another level. This virus has us. You can go on Facebook or any social media now. You see somebody broadcasting live from somewhere. They're all alone doing their thing, doing what they do. Well, all I've done is take this technology and apply it to the fact that, well, I'm still doing what I do, but I'm just doing it by myself. I'm not at these sites now with the folks. We're not sleeping in these slave dwellings together. We don't have that opportunity to sit around a campfire and have these conversations now. However, I can still go to these sites. I can still stay there. I can still tour these sites, and folks who can't be there because of the virus, and you got to factor in those folks also who don't want to be on a plantation. There are folks who look like us who don't want to set foot on the plantation because, again,
Right.
historical trauma. I want to be there eyes and ears. I want to be the person who answers the questions to these folks who think about the economics, want to take the humanity out of enslaving people. You know, I want to give these folks lives because, again, the DNA is there. But anyway, this weekend, here's what I will be doing. I will be at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. I will, at 2:30 p.m., I will start a walking tour of the site. At 4 o'clock p.m., I will do a Zoom session for an invited few folks to take part in a Zoom session with me. And throughout the night, in blocks, 8 o'clock to 8:45, 9 o'clock to 9:45, through the 11 to 11:45 period, I'm going to be checking in through Facebook. So while I'm in that slave cabin, folks can be in there with me. I'm going to be talking to them. They're going to be asking me questions about, you know, that space and that time. So that's what I'll be doing this weekend, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. I'll be broadcasting from the Slave Dwelling Project page.
Great.
Well, very good. I'll make sure that we also share it through the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce page also, because and I do promise. I said one day I'm going to come when all this clears up. I'm going to come and spend the night with you.
All right, beautiful, beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
When we get on the other side of all this, yeah, when we get comfortable in sleeping together, then we can make, you know, we can make that happen. We can make that happen.
And don't tell anybody.
All right. Hey, well, thank you. I must thank you for this opportunity. Again, you're making that digital divide smaller. So keep on doing what you're doing. And thank you again for the invitation. And thank you, Jannie.
Thank you.
And I'll follow up with your proposal writer.
Right. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. And thank you for all that you do. We go way back.
You are welcome. I'm going to be signing out now.
All right.
Okay.
We'll see you. Be safe out there.
Thanks, Joe.
So, Miss Jannie, we have about 2 minutes here, and we want to make sure, I want people to know that I will be submitting not only a gathering place for this project, but I'm going to tell my own personal story because I want to encourage others to also share their stories at greenbookofsc.com. Speak and just tell it. We want to hear it. And 50, 100 years from now, other folks are going to hear it. Any last words from you?
We want to hear it in their language. We want to hear. Don't try to make it pretty. Just tell us how you're feeling. If you want to do pictures, if you want to do graphics, whatever you want to do. And if you have questions, please feel free to email us and the email address and all is in the press release. But we're so happy, Marilyn, that you allowed us to come and talk about this project. And thank you for giving me another idea of how to do something because we've got to tell our stories. We've got to help our people. And I said, again, as Jonathan Green said, and I'm so impressed by that, it's what we're put on this planet to do. And I quite often say, I'm just doing what God puts to my hand to do. Opportunity not to have to be connected to any job or any space, so that I tell people, if you don't like what I says, you can't fire me. So we want to tell our stories. People who want to get help on anything, just call us. We're here for you.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And that is true. And it's thank you for saying it in your own voice. Even as I started this journey, I guess people get caught up and they have to be perfect. No, you don't have to be perfect. Just do it. Just speak out, say your word, because that is actually perfection from God that He allows us to speak. But you're never going to be perfect.
That's right.
But I have improved even starting these shows. Each time I do a show, I get a little bit better. No one is born knowing everything and being perfect. But practice, do it more than once, and you'll be amazed how much better you get. And it took me a long time. I'm not going to say how long to realize that. But but that's why it's just so important. Y'all tell your story. That's what we want to hear, because each single one of us has a beautiful, unique story to tell. And it's about time that our stories
Right.
are put down in, whether it's paper format or audio or video, so that 100 years from now, people are informed and empowered and have the knowledge to determine their own destiny. And that's what we're doing here. This is a long-term legacy thing that we're creating. So I'm going to be a part of it. I encourage others to be a part of it. I want to thank Miss Jannie Harriot for coming on, and Joseph McGill for coming on from the Slave Dwelling Project, and everybody tune in this weekend to his special program. And also, everyone, Miss Harriot, anything else you want to tell us before we sign off?
Black Carolinians speak. We want to hear your voices. That's it.
Very, very good. Thank you. I want to remind everyone that you are viewing A Gathering Place, hosted by the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce, every Wednesday and Sunday at 4 o'clock p.m. And I'm telling you, we've had some really great shows recently, and we're going to have a good one Sunday also. I'm just waiting for my special guest to just finalize with me, and you find out what the topic is. But please stay tuned with us. We're going to bring it to you bi-weekly, as long as we can out here. Everyone, once again, I encourage you, go to greenbookofsc.com/speak and let us hear your story. And also, everyone, be safe out there, stay home, and don't go out there if you don't have to, because we want you around. We don't need to lose any more libraries. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Miss Harriot.